Hi everybody, Greg Roark again, and we're with you today on our new episode here in our virtual STEM lab from Redbird Flight Simulations. And this particular class is called Airplane Basics. So with that, I want to show you just a couple of quick things here before we get cooking. With this, we're talking airplane basics. And when I say airplane basics, I'm not kidding. We're talking about just a general overview about airplanes. So again, remember, as we go through these classes, when we start, we're getting pretty kind of a 50,000 foot view of what we're doing, whatever subject that may be. Then as we go on, we're going to be getting more in depth and classes will become more challenging. So keep that in mind. Also remember, at the end of this, there will be a short multiple guess quiz at the end of this, at this particular class. So pay attention. Now, as we go through here, when I say basic, of course I do mean basic, we're going to answer the question, what makes an airplane an airplane? So it's that thing that we look at to say, okay, when I look at this thing, how is it, what pops into my head that automatically tells me that this is an airplane? Another thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about the anatomy of the airplane, and we'll get into the physiology of that aircraft a little bit later. Then, here as well, we're going to talk about how certain features of this airplane work. So we'll identify some of the features of the aircraft, and then we'll discuss the basics about how those things work. And then lastly, we'll begin working with airplane nomenclature. Nomenclature, of course, is a fancy word for word. You're welcome, America. So with that, let's get kicking. Here we go. We're looking here at chapter number 3 of the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. Here, chapter number 3, that's going to kind of be the basis of our talk here for this. And with that, remember that this is going to be based on that chapter. This is not real live ground school yet. So we're just going to base it on everything that we find here in chapter 3 of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. And so with that, one of the things that I want to show you here is a kind of a picture here. And I want you to tell me what it is that comes into your mind just the instant that you see it. Okay, you ready? Here we go. What did you think? It's an airplane. Good. Yes, we look at that and most of us can instantly tell what it is that we're looking at. And the thing that we're going to get into today is that as we look at it and to say, okay, what is it about that thing that we look at that says, yes, this is an airplane? Now, some of you are going to look, some of you already know some of the basic features of an aircraft, so don't get ahead of me here yet. So with that, we'll look at this. So if that's an airplane, then what is this? Well, that's an airplane too, right? But now it looks a whole heck of a lot different than the one that you just saw, right? So again, as we look at these, we have to see that there are certain features of an aircraft that we're going to be identifying. And some of those features are going to be slightly different depending upon the airplane that we're looking at. This is an airplane too, but it sure looks a lot different from that one, right? That, of course, is the P-38 Lightning. And the P-38 Lightning, as you may recall, Mr. R's favorite fighter of World War II. And then also we look at one of the steermen that we see here, a biplane. It's still an airplane, right? But it looks a whole lot different. What about this one? Yeah, that looks different too, but yet we know that that is an airplane, right? What about if we see this thing coming at you? That is correct. That is an airplane, a really, really big airplane. And in fact, when you look at that airplane, the Airbus A380, if you'll look at those engines on there, we'll talk about engines in just a moment. And when you look at the engines, this particular airplane on the A380, it has 4. One of the interesting things about those engines is the nacelle, which is the cover around that aircraft engine, is about the size of the fuselage of a Boeing 737. Now, you'll think, okay, fuselage, I do not know this thing of which you speak. We'll get into that. And then again, we can look at something and we see, okay, we look at this, and yes, we also know that this is an airplane too. So we look at this and we think, okay, well, there are some distinguishing characteristics of these things that we have identified as kind of being an airplane. And so with that, what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at an airplane. And one of the things that I have set up here today, here in my studio, and by studio, I mean my apartment, is that we're going to look at an airplane. We're going to identify some of the key features of things that make up an airplane. So with this, what we see right here on the runway is we see a Cessna 172. The Cessna 172, it has been around for decades. These are probably the most prolific aircraft around. You can always go to some airport and find at least a Cessna 172 of some vintage around that airfield somewhere. So with that, we're going to use this aircraft and we're going to talk about what it is that we see. Now, with my keyboard, and again, I'm using a Redbird J Velocity desktop flight simulator, and we're going to take just a quick little tour around this airplane. I'm going to change our view slightly. I'm going to bring this down just a little bit here, more to like about an eye level view, and we're going to go around to this airplane. One of the first things that I see here about this airplane, and I think some of you who know airplanes are going to identify what I'm seeing here, is that it almost looks like somebody needs to go out there and check the air pressure of that nose wheel right there, right? That's something that we'll get to. So again, just something that I'm seeing there. So as we look at this, we're going to walk our way around this airplane, live TV people. And so we're just going to take a look here. Now this should look familiar to a lot of you here. As we look at this airplane, as I kind of go around and I do a little 360 around this airplane, and then we're going to do a little bit different view of this airplane, and we're going to kind of do it from sort of a top-down view here as well. I'm going to back up a little bit here from this airplane so that you can see here what we're looking at. Now, as we look at this airplane from the top, we can see that there are a couple of key features to this aircraft, and I'm going to go back down here as well. And I think probably the first one that we identify is probably what? Who here said the wing? Probably so. The wing is going to be one of the most identifiable features of an airplane. And by that wing, of course, what we're talking about is we're talking about this thing here that goes from left to right across the top. That part we can see as we kind of move in there slightly is above the glare shield. This is what we call a high wing aircraft, and this sits above the pilot's head there at the top. Now, what is that wing for? What do we use the wing for? Well, those of you that said create lift, give yourselves a little pat on the back right there, because that's exactly what this wing is for. But is that the only thing that that wing does for us? Well, we'll talk about that. Now, as we look at the wing, we know that's one of the distinguishing characteristics. What about that deal out front? We see something looking like maybe it's going around there, right? Well, a lot of you might identify that as a propeller. A propeller is one of those things that we see on airplanes, those propeller-driven aircraft, that also says, okay, that may be an airplane. But we also know that there are certain airplanes that they don't have, they don't have that propeller on there. We know that's an airplane, but I don't see a propeller. Well, that's because that airplane uses a jet engine. It's some form of propulsion that actually moves that airplane down the runway to get up enough speed so then that the wing on that airplane can help create the lift that's necessary to get that airplane in the air. Without that wing, without that way to provide the propulsion down the runway to get to a particular speed, to get the molecules to flow around that wing and not create lift, we basically just have an expensive car. Because if we don't have a way to create lift, we're not going anywhere. We may go somewhere on the ground pretty fast, but we probably will not fly. So, propeller, the wing, and then we also see something else here. As I kind of move, if you look over there to the rear of the aircraft, you can see that we also have some additional stuff right there. That is what we refer to the tail of that aircraft as the empennage. Empennage, that's a French word there. It's from the French word empenneur, which means to feather an arrow. So if you think about the arrow and you think about the fletchings or the little feathers of the back of an arrow, that is what the French felt like the back of an airplane looked like. So if we look, generally, we're kind of looking there at something kind of pointy up there at the front, busy at the back. So that is kind of where we are. Now, if we look there at that propeller, we can also see that there is something there just in front of that propeller. That propeller there is preceded by this rather sharp-looking nose cone. That nose cone is called a spinner. A spinner is one of the aerodynamic elements of an aircraft. What are aerodynamics? Tune into a future class here and we'll talk more about that. So we have a spinner right there. That spinner covers this great big hub that propeller is attached to. And it makes the aircraft a little bit more aerodynamic, meaning that it helps it move through the air with a little less resistance. So we see that, then we see that spinny thingy, or the propeller. Then right behind that propeller, and I'll move my mouse here so you can see, you have a compartment right here. This is where the power plant sits underneath this covering. This covering is called a cowling, and that cowling covers an engine. The engine, in this case, it's going to be a piston engine, and that engine is going to basically take the fuel that we put in this airplane, turn that fuel into energy, and that energy then turns a crankshaft, which turns that propeller. That propeller digs into the air molecules. Yes, molecules. It's all about the molecule. It digs into those molecules to help pull that airplane down the runway until there is enough molecular flow over and under the wings to create the lift to get it off the ground. So there, we'll follow this back slightly. And this portion here is the cockpit. Now, what happens in the cockpit? Well, if we look at the cockpit here, we can see that this is where the pilot sits, right? So in this case, you can have the pilot, you can have the co-pilot there. You see that in this particular airplane, this is something that we refer to as a glass cockpit aircraft. That's what the instruments look like. We also see the aircraft controls there. Those are the controls that we can actually use to help manipulate these features that we're going to be talking about here on this aircraft. So that's the cockpit. In this part here, behind the cockpit, we have a place here for passengers. And this portion here, basically behind the cowling here where the engine is in this airplane, all of this part right back here, we call this the fuselage. So the fuselage is kind of the main body of the aircraft. Here we have a place for passengers. We also have a little door back here for some bags, not very big bags, but some bags to be sure. Go back down the fuselage here, and then we come across here some different types of aircraft structure. So here we have this tall piece here that stands vertical. This part right here is what we refer to as a vertical stabilizer. And a vertical stabilizer, how many of you have ever looked at one of these old-timey barns and you see this little weather vane at the top of it? Well, that vertical stabilizer on there helps us track into the wind as the airplane goes through the air molecules, and it helps stabilize our airplane. And that's what a vertical stabilizer helps us do. We also see on this aircraft that we have a horizontal stabilizer. So back here on this side of the aircraft, and I'm going to change my view here slightly, stand by. I'm going to come out here just a little bit, stand by. And we see here, this is what we refer to as a horizontal stabilizer. So we have the vertical stabilizer, and then we have a horizontal stabilizer. Again, as the term implies, these things help stabilize the aircraft in flight. And then, as we kind of go back here, I'm going to zoom in here slightly, and we see that we have control surfaces here. Some of the control surfaces that we'll talk about here in just a second, we're going to look at from this particular perspective. Before we do, I want to show you one other quick thing here. And this kind of helps us because I mentioned that big word nomenclature here. I want you to look here at this aircraft from this perspective. If we look here, this is the what? Spinner, correct. This is a spinner. And if we come back right down this imaginary line, right down the center of this aircraft, from the spinner to the tail, or empennage, this is what we refer to as the longitudinal axis. The longitudinal axis is that point right down the center line of the airplane, spinner to tail, and that is something whereby movement can occur. Now, you can have movement about the axis, meaning that the axis, you have movement around it, or you can also have movement of the axis itself. So the entire axis can move there also. One of those has to do with maneuverability and with actually movement about the axis. The other pertains to stability. And that stability piece is one that we get into in another section here on one of the classes down the road. So with that, remember this is the longitudinal axis from the spinner down to the tail. There are a couple more axes that we have on this aircraft. We have a horizontal or lateral axis. That goes from wingtip to wingtip. So wingtip to wingtip, that is going to be the horizontal or lateral axis. We have another axis, and this axis is a little bit different. And it's one that's a little bit harder to show on this, but if you could imagine for a second, if you could imagine a pin coming up to the very center of the aircraft, right underneath it, and you could balance that airplane right there on that pin, and you could imagine that little straight line going right through that particular section of that aircraft, that would be what we refer to as the vertical axis. And that vertical axis helps us control the directional element here of the aircraft. So we have longitudinal axis, spinner to tail, wingtip to wingtip, we have the horizontal or lateral axis, and then we have the vertical axis. Those are the three axes of an aircraft. Okay? Good so far. Now, let's take a look here. I'm going to go back to the tail section of this aircraft because I think it may be a little bit easier for us to see this here from this perspective. Now, I'm going to actually manipulate the controls of this aircraft, and I want you to see if you see any movement at all. Oh my, what's going on there? Well, if we look at that, here's what's happening. On the simulator, what I'm doing is I'm moving something called a yoke. The yoke is that thing that actually some people think is kind of like steering the airplane. We refer to that a little bit differently because we're a little snobby when it comes to airplanes. But that's kind of what it's like. It sort of banks the aircraft here. So when we look at this, we can see that there is some movement of these control surfaces here on this particular wing. These are called ailerons. Ailerons are those control surfaces which can be found on the trailing edge of the wing, and by trailing edge, I mean the back edge of the wing. I should have said this before here, guys. This is going to be what we call the leading edge. So whatever hits the air first, we call that the leading edge, and then whatever kisses the air molecules goodbye, that's what we refer to as the trailing edge. So you'll find here our first primary control surface. We will see this here on the outboard trailing edge of the aircraft. Inboard is closer to the fuselage, outboard is away from the fuselage. So we're on the trailing edge on the outboard portion here, and these are called ailerons. And what happens here with the ailerons is that it allows the airplane to bank around that longitudinal axis that we talked about. So when we look at that, it allows the airplane to bank. This would be wings straight and level, and then we can bank the aircraft by use of the aileron. You'll notice here that these ailerons move asymmetrically. That means they move opposite one another. So you'll have one aileron. If I bank the aircraft to the left, I'm turning the control here, I'm turning the yoke to the left. If I bank the aircraft here to the left, what happens is that left aileron comes up, and what happens to the right aileron? It goes down. So if I bank the aircraft to the left, left aileron comes up, right aileron goes down, and when that meets the wind, what happens is that with that aileron deflecting up, the air hits that panel here of the aileron and it pushes that wing down, while the other aircraft aileron, which is down, the air hits this and it pushes that wing up. That's how it banks to the left. So turning the control yoke to the left, left aileron up, right aileron down, aircraft banks to the left. Opposite to this as well is if I bank to the right. Right aileron comes up, left aileron comes down, and I bank to the right, okay? So that is our first primary control surface, which is called aileron. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit more here, and I'm going to show you another one. This, see what's happening here? There's a control surface that we see here in the empennage behind the horizontal stabilizer, and this is what we refer to as the elevator. The elevator, if you think about what an elevator does, you get into a big building and you say, okay, I want to go up or down. What do? Take the stairs? Nice. No, you get in an elevator. You get in an elevator and that allows you to go up or down, right? Well, the same word kind of works here as well, is that by actually taking the yoke, and if I put back pressure on the yoke, that elevator is deflected upwards. Now think about what happens as that wind that's passing that, what that's going to do to the tail. It's going to hit the top edge of that elevator and it's going to push the tail which direction? Down, correct. And when that tail goes down, what happens to the nose? Well, because of the fact that it's all connected together, the nose goes up, correct? So we think in terms of like if you want the nose of the airplane to go up, you put back pressure on the yoke. When we think about the nose, actually the movement is really happening in the tail. So that's kind of where the control surface is. So again, looking here at the elevator, back pressure on the yoke, elevator is deflected upward, passing air hits that elevator, pushes the tail down, and the nose goes up. If I put forward pressure on the yoke and I push forward pressure here, you'll see that it's deflected downward. And as it's deflected downward, then what happens there as the air hits that deflected portion there of the tail? That's right, the tail goes up and the nose goes down. So you can think about it in terms of back pressure this way, tail goes down, nose goes up, houses get smaller. You push forward on the yoke slightly with some pressure this way, then what happens? The tail goes up, nose goes down, houses get bigger. So that's kind of how that elevator works. The elevator is the second primary control surface. Now this third one that I'm going to show you here, we have three primary control surfaces. If you look here, behind the vertical stabilizer, you'll see another panel. This panel here is what we refer to as the rudder. That rudder basically moves the tail of the aircraft to the left and to the right. If I push the left rudder, what would happen is that this rudder would be deflected this direction. It would be deflected to the left. So if the passing air then hits that portion as it's deflected, it'll push the tail to the right. And that consequently will move the nose to the left. So if I want to move the nose to the left, left rudder. Nose, toes. If I want to move the nose of my airplane to my left, I'm going to press my rudder pedal, which is in the floor, to the left. And I can actually show you the rudder pedals here. We're going to look down, and you can see there on the floor, I'll zoom in, those are the rudder pedals. And that's what you push to move the tail of the airplane, are those pedals. So, nose, toes. If I want my nose to go left, I'm going to press the left rudder. And it goes the opposite way here as well. If I move here, and if I press on the right rudder, the rudder will deflect here to the right. Passing air is going to hit that deflection, pushing the tail to the left, which means that consequently my nose will go to the right. So again, nose, toes. Nose to the right, right rudder or right foot. Okay? So that is the third primary control surface. What are the three primary control surfaces? Ding, 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 ding. Test question. The three primary control surfaces are aileron, elevator, and pretend I'm moving the rudder. That would be the rudder. I know, live TV. So with that, those are the three primary control surfaces. Now with that, there are also two secondary control surfaces, and we're going to talk about those next. So I'm going to show you something else here. I'm going to move the aircraft view again to the top down. And I'm going to draw your attention here now to another control surface that we find here on the trailing edge of our wing. And this is going to be inboard of the ailerons. Remember, the ailerons are outboard over here. These are going to be inboard here of the ailerons, and they're going to be just outside of our fuselage. Now these are some things that we call flaps. I'm going to deploy the first notch or the first section of flaps here for this particular airplane. You see that movement right there? I just moved that section of that wing, of that surface, I moved it down approximately 10 degrees. And I'm going to change this here slightly to this view. I press my flap switch again, which is located here on my control console here on my simulator. I press that again, and we can see that those came down just a little bit further. I'll try to move a little close up. And now I'll go to the last section. And so with this here, this is what we refer to as the third notch, or in this case, approximately a 30-degree deflection here of these things called flaps. Now, what in the world would we use something called flaps for? How many of you said to cause drag? That'd be good. So we can use drag that we normally think of as being kind of this negative thing here about aviation. We can actually use that to our advantage. When would we want to create a lot of drag? Go ahead. Okay, when you land an airplane, well, why don't we want to just land an airplane as fast as we can go? Well, that's just bad form, because that's awfully hard on an airplane, plus our runways are not 10 miles long. So we actually need to kind of land slow. So what happens is that flaps is a control surface that a pilot can manipulate to help us land slower. We can actually put these flaps, we call them, we put in flaps, or we deploy the flaps, and they help us slow down. We use what we call our energy management lever, or our throttle. We use that, we kind of move our throttle more toward the closed position. We kind of slow down the amount of gas that we're putting here to the engine. We slow things down, and we can start incrementally putting in flaps. So we can use those to help us land. But can we use flaps for anything else? How about on takeoff? Yes, we can. Because if we put the flaps in what we call a takeoff position, or the first 10 degrees here, what happens is we can artificially extend what we refer to as the camber of that wing across the top. We can create a larger lifting area there, and we can do that in the first phase of flight, which is going to be takeoff. Now, we don't want to keep those flaps there because ultimately as our airspeed increases, it does slow us down. So we reach kind of this diminishing return about that first notch of flaps, and normally at 500 feet above the ground, we'll lift those flaps up, creating a clean surface there on our wing, and we'll have it look like this. So that now as our speed increases, we can minimize the drag and we can go faster. Because I mean, after all, that's one of the reasons that we fly airplanes, right, is to go fast. So that's how we can use flaps. I'll change the view here slightly, and I'm going to go back up top here and back up again. And flaps are considered one of our secondary control surfaces. Again, flaps, one of our secondary control surfaces. Now there's another secondary control surface, and I'm going to try to show you a view of this. This is going to be a little bit tricky, but give me just a second and I'm going to be able to get that here where I think I can show you where this is. This right here, you see this little section that's going to be on the trailing edge here of your elevator? Normally on small aircraft like this, you're only going to see one of these here on one side of your elevator. This is a little tab right here, and I'm going to try to manipulate this slightly. I'm going to show you what we're going to do. Now look where that is. Let me turn this here just a little bit. Whoops, stand by, went the wrong direction. Hang on here. You can see how that surface right there is relatively flush with this. Now, if I go inside the aircraft and I zoom up here, I'm going to take a little look over here on this side of the aircraft. You can see here on this aircraft that we have a little switch up here at the top. It's called a trim switch. Now, what does that switch do for us? What a trim switch does is that it helps us control the position of the elevator itself. So let's say, for instance, that I am wanting to bring the nose of the airplane up. So I put back pressure in this. It lifts back here the back portion of the elevator. But let's say, for instance, that I don't want to fly and just continually maintain this back pressure here. I've got other things to think about as I'm flying. If I can trim this for hands-free flight, maybe I won't have to hold it. So what we do is we activate this thing here in the back called a trim switch. Now you can barely see that. You see that moving right there? This is a little hard one to see. So what I'm doing is I am manipulating this trim tab on the back of this elevator to help me keep this up. Now let's think about this. If the trim tab goes down, like I have it right there, that air that's passing underneath that horizontal stabilizer is going to hit that trim tab, and it's going to raise the elevator in the direction that I want it to go. Now that way, when I do that, I don't have to sit here and pull back here on the yoke. I can use that trim tab to relieve those control pressures so I'm not having to maintain that pressure to maintain my pitch attitude that I want. Pitch attitude, we'll get into that later. To maintain that pitch attitude. So it's a very, very handy piece of equipment to have. Now, you can have the trim tabs, almost all aircraft are going to have them on the elevator. Some aircraft are going to have them also on the rudder. For instance, I fly a Cessna 206 stationair, and so on my airplane I also have trim here for the rudder, so I don't have to maintain the constant pressure on my feet to keep the tail behind the nose. In other words, to keep my airplane flying straight. Then even more advanced aircraft, they will actually have trim tabs here on the ailerons as well. So it's not uncommon to have a trim tab on all three primary control surfaces, but for basic training aircraft, you're really only going to have it on the actual elevator itself. And then as your airplane gets a little bit bigger, then you'll see it on the rudder. And then as your airplane in some cases gets faster, then you're going to see that out there on the ailerons. So we have two secondary control surfaces. Ding, 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 ding. Two secondary control surfaces. We have flaps and we have trim. So flaps, those operate inboard, they operate symmetrically. And then we have the trim tab on the back. That is what we refer to as a secondary control surface. Okay? So those are kind of the primary things that we have here about an airplane that kind of makes it an airplane as opposed to just an expensive car, right? So let's take a look here at our airplane. Now I'm going to clean our flaps up. So I'm going to bring this area, this notch of flaps up here, notch of flaps up here, and I'm going to move my view back here. I'm going to clean up my trim situation here, and then we're going to change our view. Now we're in the cockpit. I'm going to bring our view back slightly. I'm going to bring our view up. Stand by. And now this is the view that we would see in the cockpit if you were the pilot. This is kind of what this looks like. So this is you sitting in the cockpit. Now if we look over here, this is where your co-pilot, or you could also have a passenger in here as well. These are going to be the back seats here that we see here of a Cessna 172. Now notice how many seats you have in a Cessna 172. You see 4 seats. Now a lot of people, they will look here at a 4-seat aircraft and they'll think, oh wow, this is cool, I can carry 4 people. Well, not necessarily. There's an old adage in aviation, especially when it comes to operating small airplanes. You can fill the seats or you can fill the tanks, but you can very seldom fill both. Now why is that? Because there are weight limitations to what you can put in an airplane. Now you can put passengers in there, but if you put passengers in there, you're not going to be able to carry as much fuel. And then if you don't carry as many passengers, you can carry more fuel. Well gosh, I wonder where would we put that fuel? How about if we put the fuel in the wings? That's correct. And I'm going to zoom in here and I'm going to show you something. Now, if you look here, do you see this red cap? This red cap is one of 2 fueling areas here on this aircraft. I'll zoom down slightly here. Oh, we're not going to be able to see it in that one, maybe on this one. Hang on. Okay, and you can see both red caps. So we put fuel in the wings. So not only do the wings help us create lift, but it's also a great place for us to carry the fuel. One of the cool things about carrying fuel here in a high wing aircraft is the fact that when you look here and you think, okay, well, if my gas can is above, we have gravity that can help move that fuel from up top down into that engine. So there are going to be gravity fuel feeds. So that kind of helps simplify things. Not to say that we can't use fuel in low wing airplanes. We just need to use pumps to be able to move that fuel from the lower wings here and to move that to the engine where we need it, right? So with that, as we look here, the wings do what? The wings create lift, and they also do what? Test question. They can also do what? In small airplanes like this, we can carry fuel in those wings. Now, does that mean that all airplanes like this carry fuel in the wings? Well, if we look here at, and excuse me here, I'm going to change my view here slightly. So if we look at an airplane here like a 747, sure, we can have fuel in the wings, and we can also here have fuel in the wings of like an Airbus A380. But in aircraft like these big 747s, one of the things that they can do is that we have fuel containers that are actually in the fuselage. Remember, the fuselage is that thing with all of this stuff here along that side. So it goes from the longitudinal axis, and down low we have fuel tanks. So big airplanes like this 747, they can have fuel in the wings, but they also have fuel there in fuel storage containers in the fuselage itself. So with that, I am going to move this back here to this view here of our Cessna 172. And so that is there the wings. We've talked about the primary control surfaces. We've talked about the secondary control surfaces. We have talked about the spinner, the propeller, the cowlings here, the engine, the cockpit, passenger compartment, baggage compartment, empennage back here at the back. What about down here? What is going on here? Well, as I mentioned before, with this, looks like that we have a tire that needs some air. So I just think that's funny. So, but we have landing gear, right? So we have landing gear. What does landing gear help us do? So the landing gear, as the name applies, helps us either land and helps us taxi. So we have to have something to hold those tires there onto the airplane. Well, in this particular case here on a Cessna 172, the type of landing gear that we have are something that we refer to as fixed gear. So I'll rotate this around here and you can see what that looks like. You can see that there are struts that come out from the bottom portion of the fuselage. They extend out at about a 45 degree in this case, and they go down here to where the tires are affixed to this particular aircraft. This is called a fixed gear aircraft. And then we have other airplanes that actually are not fixed gear aircraft. So for instance, if we look here at this aircraft, my favorite, this is my P-38 Lightning, you can see that there aren't any tires hanging down here. That's because this aircraft is equipped with what we refer to as retractable gears. So a retractable gear aircraft then is one where the wheels get tucked up either up into the wings or up into the fuselage. So that's a retractable gear aircraft. And as I say, this one is one where we have retractable gear. And then this aircraft is what we refer to as a fixed gear aircraft. Now, in addition to the Cessna 172 being a fixed gear aircraft, it is also something that we call a tricycle gear configuration. That's where you have a nose wheel of therefore in the landing gear, as opposed to something that we call a tail wheel, or like they refer to as a conventional. And with this, you can see that here in the old Stearman, that the main landing gear, the ones with the bigger tires, those seem to be put a little bit further forward than they were on our Cessna 172, but instead of a nose wheel here, we actually have a tail wheel. So this is a tail wheel aircraft, or tail dragger, as they say. And these types of aircraft, they're a little bit trickier in operating these aircraft on the ground. In fact, it takes a special endorsement to fly a tail wheel equipped aircraft because they are a little bit tricky to handle on the ground versus a tricycle gear aircraft that we have here with our Cessna 172. So with that, those are the primary differences here and kind of that nomenclature piece that I was talking to you about these aircraft. And again, I'll zoom back out here and take a look here at our Cessna 172, and you can take a look at this with that there. I'm changing something else here, guys. Forgive me here with this. So with this, I want to show you a couple of other things here just real quick. As we look here at the end of this particular class, remember, stay tuned. There's going to be a short multiple guess quiz. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. Turn on those notifications, because as you do, and as things kind of change here, if people like what we're doing here, if they want to see more of what we're doing, and we want to get more into more like complex subject matter like we would in a traditional ground school, we can do that, and we can let you know here through this particular channel. So know that, turn on those notifications. The other thing that I want to show you here just quickly is just kind of a reminder about some of the classes. We've already done our aviation appreciation course. This is our airplane basics class that we did. Aviation weather, that's coming up next. These again are going to be basic courses. I teased you a little bit about aerodynamics. There it is coming up. Also that wing, how the airplane does create lift and how it does more than just hold fuel, so keep that in mind. And then we also have on the books here aeronautical decision making, and this again is one of those kind of those thoughty classes that that we'll have here that I think that you're going to like. Guys, I want to thank you for watching. I want everybody to stay safe out there because I want you to come back. Again, thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this, and remember, we'll get into this next time. Our next class coming up here is going to be aviation weather. It's going to be relatively basic, but I think we're going to have some fun. Anyway, Anyway, guys, I appreciate you, and I'm glad that you guys are here. I'm glad that you're tuning in. Thank you very much for doing that. And so on behalf of all of us here at Redbird Flight Simulations, we want to say thanks, and we'll see you next time.